Welcome back to the show. My name is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to episode 67 of Slick Talk. This one is titled Making Oil. You want your engine to make good power, but you do not want it to make oil. What we mean by that is if the oil level is increasing on the dipstick, or if you are draining more oil than you put in, then your engine is quote-unquote making oil. Of course, it's not oil per se. This indicates contamination. I'm going to break down what exact contaminants could be in play and how we find them in testing. But before the main event, we are going to introduce another Catchpan segment. This one comes courtesy of Phil, a friend of the program. Phil sent along a couple of questions that I believe apply to many of our listeners out there. For some, this information may be familiar, but even if you've heard it before, it doesn't hurt to have a reminder for certain results, what they mean, whether or not you should consider them cautionary. The first one is in regards to shearing. I've discussed this on some recent episodes, and Phil was wondering under what scenarios would shearing be considered harmless, and why is it going on? Is it a result of defective oil? Does it speak to the engine running too hot? So on and so forth. In short, shearing is a breakdown of viscosity improving additives in the oil. Now, why would we consider it harmless? Well, it's normal for a lot of engines. Common one would be the 6.0 Power Stroke. It's normal to see a low viscosity, even in the absence of fuel dilution, and it's the lack thereof that generally constitutes shearing not being a concern. A low viscosity is going to accompany these used oil samples, but without signs of poor wear, without contamination that's going to thin the oil down. The viscosity is really just something to note. It does not translate to a problem that you need to address. Now, a lot of customers will email and ask if they should try a thicker grade. Well, you could, but I wouldn't expect the viscosity to stay in range, and I also wouldn't expect other results to improve just as a result of having a thicker oil in place. I wouldn't expect, for example, wear metals to be in better standing, TBN to be stronger, so on and so forth. This experimentation is always up to you, but whether or not it will translate to any sort of improved result is a long shot in my book. I've just seen way too many instances of 6.0 samples, or just going into the whole spectrum of motorcycle engines, for example, or smaller turbocharged motors. It's common to have that viscosity, and shearing is a likely explanation when you do not have contamination, like fuel, that would thin the oil down. Nor do you need to address the viscosity, especially when everything else looks great. Remember, we are looking for signs of healthy wear as an indicator of the oil working well, and you can look at other aspects of the oil to see what condition it was in. A strong TBN can show active additive remaining. You can rest easy on a good report with favorable results in every other area to alleviate any concerns about the viscosity in particular. Next up, we're going to address sampling with the pump. Now, Phil was inquiring about using our vacuum pump to draw a sample from the dipstick, and fairly so, had some concerns because depending on the forum or the user, you might have come across some quote-unquote horror stories of folks trying to sample from the dipstick and going about it the wrong way. Now, if you are careless, you can indeed cause some trouble when you're trying to sample from the dipstick tube if you're not careful about the way in which you go about it. And we understand that retrieving a sample from the dipstick tube can be a foreign concept to a lot of owners out there. And for that reason, we do have a video on our website, blackstone-labs.com. Go under the information tab, then click on videos. We have a video featuring the president of Blackstone Laboratories, Ryan Stark. He's going to walk you through through step by step exactly what you should do. But as long as you are using tubing that goes the length of the dipstick tube and you're not having any trouble with the tube fitting down the dipstick tube, you can retrieve a sample and not expect to damage or harm the engine in any sort of way. So remember, use the dipstick as a measuring tool for how much of the tube you're going to need. And then as long as you are not having any sort of blockage or any sort of issue with the width of the tube, then you will be good to go. But when you are setting up for a sample, and if you have any question about how to use the pump, how to avoid getting it dirty, what you should do after you are done sampling, and how you should store the tubing after you have retrieved the oil, just consult that video. Remember, it's on our website, blackstone-labs.com. Go under information, click on videos, and you'll find the video featuring our president, Ryan Stark. I used that video myself when I was first obtaining a sample just to make sure I was going about it the right way. It's a very helpful tool, and I would encourage anyone who is sampling without changing the oil to check it out before doing so. Now it's time to talk about making oil. Now, there are two likely reasons for your engine to be quote-unquote making oil. Either there's contamination from coolant or fuel dilution. Now, these are the most common instances we come across. Of course, there can be exceptions to the rule. We can't rule out instances of, say, vandalism causing the oil level to be high on the dipstick. But normal problems to come across, reasons for that oil level to be high other than someone adding more oil than they need, would be coolant or fuel. Now, when you're looking at coolant in testing, it's going to show up as potassium and sodium. We can find actual water from the coolant as well if the situation is bad enough, but more often than not, moisture from the coolant has evaporated, and we generally are looking at the potassium and sodium that are left behind, so that even when the moisture is gone, you can still find the footprint of coolant in those elements. Now on to fuel. Fuel will show up in testing as a low flash point. The lower the flash point, the more fuel you have. In addition to fuel thinning the oil down, it causes a high oil level if there is enough of it, and then you can also have a low viscosity. So not only are we going to look at the indicators of fuel being present, we can also look at the side effects, including a low viscosity. Excess fuel can also dilute the elements down. So in cases where there is excess fuel, it's not unusual to see, for example, oil additives like calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, zinc, for them to be very low for what we would typically expect from a given oil due to fuel diluting those elements down. And of course, if you're in a marine application and you're just getting fresh water contamination, then we might not find much sodium or potassium, but we can still find the actual moisture that will register in testing as well. So if you're getting water, either in the form of antifreeze, fresh water, salt water, all of that will show up in testing. And if you are getting contamination from fuel, that will show up as a low flash point. Now, there is the possibility of a false positive, so to speak, when you come across these elements and these flash point temperatures. And I want to talk about specific things to keep in mind if we report indicators of coolant and you've done your homework and you figure out there's no way for there to be contamination, yet you're still having these indicators of it. I want to break down reasons why that may be, exceptions to keep in mind. So first of all, if you're sampling a diesel engine. This has happened before where I've seen samples where there is an unreasonably high sodium level, an indicator of coolant, and the customer has covered the bases. They've pressure tested the cooling system. They're not noticing any decrease in the reservoir that would suggest coolant is getting in the crankcase, yet we have all this sodium. Well, what has happened before, now this is rare, but because it has occurred, I feel like it's only fair to discuss the possibility, is that a customer has reported gasoline engine oil being in use. Now, whether that was due to a mistake or whether that was due to them being careless, thinking that they thought it would work just as well as the oil that is called for, well, let's just say I've seen each of those scenarios as well. But importantly, Some gasoline engine oils do utilize sodium. So if you are a diesel engine owner, we report sodium, you have covered the bases, found there is not a coolant leak, then the presence of sodium can indicate that a gasoline engine oil was in place. So what about situations where we're looking at a gasoline engine oil and trying to call coolant? Well, in those cases, it's particularly important that you let us know the brand and the blend that you're running. Some gasoline engine oils use sodium, but not all of them. For example, if you're running Mobil Super, some of their oils have sodium, but not Mobil 1. So be as specific as you can when noting the oil that you're running, and we'll let you know if that oil is known to have sodium in it or not. But of course, we're not just going to rely on sodium, we're also going to rely on potassium, the other coolant marker, to indicate a leak. Listeners of previous episodes might remember that potassium can also show harmless flux, but we are aware of the contexts in which to expect that harmless flux. So it's not as if you can see potassium and always have to suspect that it is flux. With flux tends to come high aluminum, and these elements also tend to show up early on in the engine's life or after there has been work done or a delete of the EGR or any other part included in the emission system, the intercooler, etc. So we are mindful of the context in which to expect harmless flux. We also know that with flux there tends to be other things like high aluminum, and we also know that if you're looking at a diesel engine, there's no reason for there to be high potassium and high sodium at the same time other than there being coolant. Finally, one last caveat I want to talk about in regards to coolant markers and potassium in diesel engines specifically. A lot of diesel engine owners do like using Arch Oil or Revex. These additives are known to contain potassium as well, but yet again, we have context clues to help us determine when it's additive and when it's coolant. Additives like Arch Oil and Revex also use a hearty amount of boron. So if we do not see a boron level indicative of additive, then it's not likely to have that potassium be from additive and not contamination. If this all sounds like a lot to keep track of, well, it is, and that's why during the analysis process, you can count on whoever is looking at your results to take into account additives, whether it's a low mileage engine or not, how these elements relate to each other, the ratios of them. We keep all of this in order so you don't have to by detailing the caveats, these scenarios in which the results might not make sense. Again, first, you want to rule out things like there being the wrong oil in use or recent work or any other instance that might be playing a role before assuming that one of these caveats applies to you and your engine. And if you find out that there's a repair you should have noted, or the wrong oil was in use, or there's an additive you forgot to mention, let us know. We'll take it into account. But short of there being an additive or something that you forgot to mention, you can rest on the results and the analyst taking into account all of the context clues when calling out contamination. Now, with regards to fuel, again, I spoke of that being evident in the flash point temperature. The only way for a flash point to be low other than fuel is if there is a solvent-based contaminant. So if you have an engine oil and you have not used something like a flush, say, or any other solvent product recently, then there's really no likely explanation other than fuel for a low flash point. So do let us know if you forgot to mention a flush or any similar product that might have lowered the flash point. But other than fuel, that's really the only likely way for that flash point to be low. And again, we can look at previous samples to see if you've had a low flash point even without the additive, or we can also speak to how that contaminant is impacting the rest of the sample, such as viscosity and additive levels, when determining its effect. So to do a quick recap, there are two likely reasons for an engine to be making oil, those being coolant or fuel dilution. We can determine both of them in our standard analysis. Now, with coolant, There are multiple sources for the elements potassium and sodium, and we'll take into account whether it's likely that an additive or flux could be in play as possible explanations. But we know what to expect, whether it is a new engine, whether it is an additive. So if you are, say, in an instance where you're sampling a young engine and maybe you have used an additive that contains these elements, it doesn't mean that you should shy away from sending in the sample. It doesn't mean that we won't know what to do with it. Even if you have used an additive, and even if it's a young engine, we still have the context clues, and we know how these elements should relate to each other, both when they are harmless and when they are indicators of contamination. We'll keep all of that straight, and we'll factor it in when making the call. And of course, there is the instance of simply being water and not coolant. And if you're in the marine application, we can find evidence of it either in just simply the water being present. We can also find sodium that can indicate if that is seawater and not just fresh water. Whether the contaminant is coolant, water, fuel, we have a way to detect each one and understand not only if it's present, but give you an overview of what effect that contamination is having on the engine up to that point. Some of you may be wondering what to do next. When you have this contamination present, what's your next move? And really that can be different for everyone. It depends on how advanced the problem is. If that problem is coinciding with poor wear, how the oil is holding up in spite of it. It's really different for everyone and the amount of contamination present. Some engines are also just able to handle contamination better than others, and a lot goes into that. Use, oil change intervals, whether or not the customer is keeping the reservoir topped off as needed, say when coolant contamination is a factor. There's so much that goes into how an engine will get along with either contaminant present. So there's not an across-the-board rule book on what to do next, but used oil analysis is a way to understand how you should respond. So take the example of an engine having a coolant leak and the owner is currently sampling 3,000-mile intervals. That may be a short enough interval to keep that contamination in check and avoid poor wear taking place as a result of that contamination accumulating, but not for everyone. It depends how severe that leak has grown. If it's getting worse and metals are getting worse in tandem, then shortening the interval would be the next move. On the other hand, if you have a leak that's proving to be slight and it's not getting worse and the owner is able to go, say, 5,000 miles, then you won't necessarily need to try a shorter interval. You simply have to see how the trend plays out in a report to understand if you need to make any adjustments to the maintenance plan, but all the while using analysis and also paying close attention to things like coolant loss in the reservoir is critical in keeping your engine on the road. Of course, repairs are going to be the best medicine, but they are not always something you need to proceed with right away, especially if you find yourself in an instance where the engine is proving to wear well, you're able to keep the contamination in check with precise oil change intervals. Well, then sometimes it's worth it to just check back and see how the trend looks, because truth be told, some engines are able to keep those contaminants in check, and there's not always the need for invasive or expensive repairs. If you think your engine is making oil and you want to know more about it, a standard analysis is all you need to understand what contaminant could be causing it and whether or not you need to make adjustments to your maintenance plan as a result of that contaminant being present. As always, if you have any questions about today's topic, how to proceed or get started with testing, don't hesitate to call or email us. Phone number is 260-744-2380, or you can email us at bstone@blackstone-labs.com. That wraps up today's episode. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.